Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. We're going to get started with our DevOps webinar brought to you by TechStrong and Orca Security. My name is Jared Harris, and I'll be your host for today's discussion titled Securing Kubernetes at Scale, Deploying Uncrackable Clusters. We've got an exciting panel for you, but before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. Today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion today, or you'd like to share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after the webinar, and a link will be included in the email as well. If you have any questions, we'd like to hear from you. You can submit those in the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. You can also find the chat tab. Chat tab is also on the right side of the screen. You can engage with our speakers. You can engage with other audience members, share your thoughts, or just tell us where you are tuning in from. We will upload a handout towards the end of the discussion, and we are also going to have some polls throughout the webinar, so please stick around. We'd love to hear your results. We're also going to have four Amazon gift cards giveaway at the end of today's session, so be sure to stick around for that as well. And at this time, Mitch, I'll turn my mic off and my webcam off, and I'll turn it over to you for introductions.
Awesome. Jared, thank you very much for kicking things off. Everyone, thank you for joining us today. We hope you all have water. You know, it's super hot around the world, in Europe and US, everywhere. So stay hydrated. We need you with us for the full hour here. We have a great conversation. We're talking about securing Kubernetes. And today's webinar, today's panel session is sponsored by the great folks at Orca Security. So thank you to the team, Sarah, the whole team at Orca, who's working with TechStrong Group to put this on with you. As we mentioned, we're going to be doing some live polling here because we're going to be sharing with you some data that we collected from our DevOps.com, Security Boulevard, and Container Journal audiences. So we can kind of look at, here's where I kind of fit. Maybe I'm like this similar to folks in this area. Maybe I have a little bit different opinion here. It'd be great for you to compare where you think you are on some of the questions we're going to discuss. This is all built around some research that we did in cooperation with Orca Security and TechStrong Research. I have the pleasure of being both CTO with TechStrong Group and also principal with TechStrong Research, and getting to work with great companies like Orca Security. So before we get into all of that, I have the great pleasure of being joined by Jacob and by Keith. Jacob, do you want to start out just to introduce yourself? Tell folks a little bit about you, kind of so they know where you're coming from, and maybe if either one of you want to say just a little bit about Orca Security if someone's not familiar with the company.
Yeah, so I'll start off first. Keith and I are both from Orca Security. We're the first agentless cloud security platform that gives you workload deep visibility, so seeing vulnerabilities and malware and misconfigurations and all these other security vulnerabilities that you have on your workloads, whether they're Kubernetes or VMs or whatever they may be. But today we're going to be talking a lot about Kubernetes, obviously. Personally, I have a lot of experience in that space. I worked at Twistlock and Palo Alto Networks, and now I'm at Orca Security. And just my role as a security engineer, and I'm just excited to talk with you guys today.
Fantastic. Okay, Keith, take it away.
Mitch, thanks for having us. I'm really excited to be here with Jacob. I've worked together with him both at Twistlock and Palo Alto Networks. So he's the type of person that's taught me a ton about containers, Kubernetes, and really the entire cloud stack. And, you know, like he said, Orca is really trying to solve a lot of different problems, whether it's vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, or many other different cloud risks for organizations. And I'm really excited to, talk about our container and Kubernetes topics today.
Excellent, excellent. I've had the pleasure, too, of talking and interviewing Avi Shua, your CEO.
Yeah.
Learning a little bit about your technology and some of the unique things about it and securing the cloud and finding out what's going on. You may not realize what needs to be secured in addition to containers and Kubernetes. So great company and great people. Well, let's dive into this. I also want to recommend everybody jump in on the chat. This can be a dialogue. This can be a conversation. You can actually help direct our conversation, contribute to it. Challenge question if you have a different opinion about something. Join in on the chat, ask a question. We will incorporate that as much as we can and have you be having this conversation with us instead of us at you. So there's your chance to be part of it and shape the direction of the next 50 minutes. Well, let's jump into it. We're not going to do death by slides, but we are going to present some polls that are part of the research that we did. And we're first going to ask those questions of our audience. So Jared, would you put up the first poll question? How many clusters do you run on your Kubernetes-based applications today? So assuming you are, maybe you aren't running Kubernetes yet, so there's an option for that. So if you would, click which sounds like the most correct or the closest answer for your environment. And we'll share the results here as they're coming in live and in person. Good. We're getting some good responses from folks here. Let's see how we're doing. Okay, great. Here's your chance. We're gonna cut things off here just in a minute. Yep, we got some more votes. Jump right in. Clock's ticking. We won't start the Jeopardy music, but you get the idea. Okay, great. Let's go ahead and close the poll, Jared. If you want to show we've got the results up there. Cool. So interesting. Open source managed Kubernetes from a provider, cloud service provider. I noticed that in some of our data too. A lot of folks are getting that from different online service providers, enterprise platforms. And of course, we have folks, not everybody's on Kubernetes yet, right? There we have 8%. So let's take a look at this. We have about half doing enterprise here, a quarter doing managed service provider, cloud service provider, 17%. Let's go ahead and take that down, Jared, and we'll pop back to our slide. Let's look at this now. We pulled the audiences on DevOps.com, Container Journal, Security Boulevard. So we're touching both the security audience, a DevOps audience, a software engineering audience, folks that do this. So here's where we came out. Oops, I'm on the wrong question. We popped up the wrong question here. Let me jump ahead to that one, the one we asked here. Sorry, my bad. There we go. Okay, great. So open source, I think in our audience, we were less than this. We're like around 17%, if I remember right. Enterprise was the dominant answer there. It's the much smaller answer here. And so cloud service provider being kind of in between those. And in the broader audience, of course, if you're coming to a panel discussion about Kubernetes, there's probably a better chance you're going to be using it than maybe a broader audience that's reading some of the content on our sites. Reactions. Jacob, if you want to jump in, we'll let you do your introduction first, so we'll let you speak first here.
Yeah, so it's not surprising that managed Kubernetes clusters are catching on. If you're running in a cloud provider, it's likely that you're going to go with that instead of something like an OpenShift, which you maybe would use more on-prem. But the managed Kubernetes makes it so much simpler to deploy and operate and get things spun up really quickly. When we talk about how many clusters people have, I expect that people with a lot of clusters are probably these people using the managed Kubernetes because it's so easy to get something stood up quickly and have some assurance that it's done in the right way because you are leaning on the expertise of those cloud service providers. Mm-hmm. So, and these are things, of course, like GKE, EKS, AKS, all of those things that come from Azure and Google and AWS, of course.
Yeah, and I think, building on what Jacob shared, using cloud native technologies like Kubernetes are all about flexibility. And I think it just really speaks to the market, the fact that there's many different flavors of Kubernetes out there. And so depending on how large your organization is, depending on your engineering, DevOps, deployment, and management of these applications and how you want to do that, you're able to really benefit from a lot of the managed options or enterprise grade options that are out there. And that can ultimately alleviate a lot of stresses and work that organizations need to do configuring something from top to bottom themselves, experimenting with an open source version of Kubernetes and then migrating to one of these more manageable, scalable tech stacks that I think is very, very common given how all of the cloud providers are really investing in these tech stacks being best in class.
Yeah, and I think that group of not using Kubernetes, when they do adopt Kubernetes, they're going to land in a cloud service provider Kubernetes or an enterprise Kubernetes. That open source group, those are probably your early adopters. They probably got things stood up early. The number of those clusters won't go down, but the share of Kubernetes clusters that enterprises are running are going to be, the bulk of them are going to be cloud service providers with enterprise Kubernetes. It's just, that's really the way the market's moving.
I suspect you're right, because as you increase the more you're doing with it, the number of clusters, et cetera, the more distributed they are, the more complexity. Kubernetes, I think all of us would agree, is a fairly complex technology, especially to do at scale. So there's probably that tipping point. I don't have data correlated to validate this, but I would suspect there is a point where you say, okay, I know what I needed to know about running the open source and trying to operate that myself. Let's look at an option like a cloud service provider, as you were suggesting. Does that jive with your gentleman's thinking?
Yeah, and a lot of the memes you see about Kubernetes, like, oh, I had a problem, I picked Kubernetes, now I have 10 problems, that kind of thing. That, I think a lot of that comes from operating that open source cluster. The more you move towards something where it's managed, it's so much easier. That sort of the take from 3 years ago doesn't jive with the reality of today. The reality of today is almost every enterprise could stand up a Kubernetes cluster today. I could go in Google Cloud and spin one up in 5 minutes and have things running in production grade deployments. So the more you can move to manage, the more expertise you're leaning on really experienced platforms, the better.
Yeah, something I think is might be a bit hidden in this data is, I don't think there's any great secret. There is a plethora of offerings, managed security offerings. You can get Kubernetes from just about everybody. I don't know if you can get it at the 7-Eleven, but you can get it from VMware. You can get it from the cloud provider. The variations, they call them distributions, right? Well, every one of those are not ones you configured. You'd like to think that they all have done it securely. I'll bet they're human, and so they probably haven't. So that introduces a whole nother complexity, just even to the line of either the enterprise or the managed Kubernetes option. So it presented even a greater challenge. Gentlemen, you can disagree or agree. I'm just putting it out there. You can tell me what you think.
No, I completely agree with you, Mitch. And I think ultimately, when you take a step back in 2022 and think, if I'm using Kubernetes, what problems am I trying to solve? You're trying to scale your applications and give, again, more agile business value to your internal or external customers. And so ultimately, you're like, this technology can unlock a lot of benefits for me. And I've got a lot of different flavors of that tech stack in order to do it. But I think, like you and Jacob have, highlighted, if there's less architecture, less infrastructure that I need to take care of myself, these solutions solve that side of the problem. And there's a lot of smart engineers, smart architects building, architecting, scaling those solutions. You can go and focus on your business applications and not focus on, updating another piece of open source software at your org.
Very good. Well, let's shift to, if you're ready, let's shift to another question that we're going to ask our audience. So what is your top Kubernetes security concern? I'm sure the list, I'll talk to security people. That list is never short, right? So we have a few options that we're presenting. I can say that because I'm a security person too. Risks around container vulnerabilities, of course, access controls. We have that everywhere. Insecure networking, runtime. It's not just about setting it up. Up-to-date versioning and disaster recovery. Interesting here. Why don't you go ahead and start showing the results? And as they roll in, we're getting some good responses. So please keep, if you're in process of thinking about your answer, go ahead and jump right in.
Yeah, this is a great question. I'm looking forward to seeing the data.
Yeah, we didn't offer an all of the above, which have been unfair because then
of course,
that right, of course, that's always the cheater answer. But even though if it's the truest, so we're hanging out there with improper access control. That's right up there with cross-site scripting and SQL injection, right? I mean, it's like been with us since the day we let a second person access something that we configured.
Yeah, exactly.
Not quite as old as time, but pretty close, as the Disney song goes. Well, interesting. Okay, we've got some great response. So obviously our dominant response here is improper access control. Risk for container vulnerabilities is right, kind of matched evenly there. I guess they are actually even between the first, third, and fourth. Up-to-date versioning control. I thought one of the interesting option here was runtime protection. It's not always something we discuss. because it was sure secure in test, but what does production look like? Well, why don't we pull that up, and we will look at our research, talking to or getting data from our audiences that read DevOps.com, watch TechStrong TV, Container Journal, Security Boulevard. Sorry if I'm name plugging, but that's who we got this data from. So here we're seeing a much bigger response from risks from container vulnerabilities. Improper access control is right there with up-to-date versions. So we get a little bit of a different mix here. So, again, we may have an audience, I suspect, that might be a little bit closer to their use of Kubernetes. Who knows? You also may be getting folks coming here that are maybe a little bit newer too, and you're just kind of not sure which way to read. I'm a little bit surprised the runtime protection is as low as it is, because we live in such dynamic environments with Kubernetes and cloud native microservices, all of this stuff. What it looked like 5 minutes ago doesn't mean that's what it is right now, right? It can change rather dramatically. What are your reactions? Why don't you jump in, Keith?
Yeah, and let me know if my camera froze for a second there. I had to reset it. But ultimately, I do agree. Like, if you had an all of the above answer, I think a lot of people would have clicked it right away, because all of these risks are things that you need to think about for any application you're running, especially a highly distributed, impactful business application. And so, number one, I'm not surprised to see risk from vulnerabilities being the highest, because I think whether you're part of the cloud security team, the vulnerability management team, or you have an AppSec background, you understand that a vulnerability in an application presents risk to your organization. And an attacker can potentially try and exploit that to gain access to sensitive information that's part of your application or connected to your application. So I think that just makes a lot of sense, where you understand you're running code. Developers can pull this code down from templates, whether it's Docker Hub or some other sort of public repository, and that can ultimately lead to potential risk. I think the other interesting part really just speaks to the complexity of the Kubernetes tech stack, where you have to think about access control and making sure that all your defaults are secure. Kubernetes presents this big flat network, but you need to approach networking and security in a new way, whether you're using manual parts of your CNI or Kubernetes native types of networking controls, or you're using some third-party solution that can provide you benefits, but it's still going to be very complex and have a learning curve. So ultimately, I just think this speaks to the breadth and depth of Kubernetes and having to really think about security across the entire stack. And that's where I'll kind of get started and see kind of what Jacob and Mitch you chime in with.
Well, I'm gonna let you pick that one up, Jacob.
Yeah, just kind of to go back to the container vulnerabilities, I think this the underlying risk here is what is running in my cluster, whether I built it or following kind of the promise of containers. I can pull in these base layers, I can pull in these pre-built applications and get things running right away, but I didn't build it. In our VM world, we probably deployed the VM and we build everything up and run our agents on there to make sure the vulnerabilities are not present, but you didn't necessarily build the things that are running in your cluster if you're pulling in these containers. So it's a really blind spot for what is actually running. And access control goes along those same way, that same direction. Who is able to run things in my cluster? How do I know only the correct service accounts, so the correct users can spin things up in that cluster? And access control goes much further when you start looking at the cloud as well, because your cloud cluster that you deployed is using IAM and RBAC and all of these things from your cloud provider. So then you have a little bit bigger blast radius as well. If a user account is compromised, now they can potentially spin things up in that cluster, but also maybe access S3 buckets and all of these other things. So it's just risk kind of compiling there. But those are the two ones that jump out at me. Runtime protection, to your point, Mitch, is really, really hard in Kubernetes. Your containers might run for 5 minutes and go away. If you're monitoring each process and each file system read and write and each network call, that can be a flood of data on things that are just ephemeral and are going away. So it's really, really hard. And so doing these basic things like controlling your access control and doing your container vulnerabilities is going to go a long way to protecting you against things. And maybe that's why runtime protection is coming in a little lower here. It's a advanced sort of protection for that environment.
It's sort of the more you do, the longer you've been doing it, the more you find those types of challenges too. I was thinking when I first saw this data about the container vulnerabilities, things coming from images. It was like the low-hanging fruit example is Log4j, right? I mean, how prevalent is that? That's something isn't even your vulnerability necessarily, but the whole tech stack, right, is living in various containers across, all the clusters in n number of instances of those containers. So it's like, get it right before it goes out. Try to find those things ahead of time. Yes, you want to find problems when you're in production too, but that's one of the greatest ways to make sure that you're secure, especially when you're using not just your software, but entire stacks of other software. And then access control, you were mentioning, Jacob, about the tech stack isn't just the software you're deploying, right? It's the services you're running this on. It's the security services for IAM and for storage and everything else, S3. It's always about misconfiguration. That's, one of the top vulnerabilities, if you will, or the sources of an incident. So there's a lot of good stuff here, I think, that can help folks as they're looking to scale the security. So I'm going to kind of break a rule of mine. This is a non-product pitch, non-vendor. I mean, it's sponsored by Orca Securities, but we're not making it a big demo and big Orca security pitch. I would love to hear, because I know a little bit about the technology that you all use and looking at someone's cloud environment. If you just put your Orca hat on for a couple of minutes, how would you respond to this data? Whoever wants to take that, and then we'll flip that switch back to kind of nonpartisan. We'll just talk about the topics.
Yeah, I think Jacob, I'll start, but I think at first we at Orca we just want to give you a lot of visibility and help you prioritize risks, whether you're using any different flavor of Kubernetes and all the other interconnected services that are connecting to your clusters and your applications. And so without you having to deploy anything, we want to surface those vital misconfigurations. We want to surface that vulnerability data. And ultimately, with a lot of the newer features we've released, show you how those risks or misconfigurations, if interconnected, would add to your overall risk. And I think this is just really important, not only coming from Orca, but as you think about this tech stack, you want to make sure that your security team that has limited time every day and every week can solve the most important problems when it comes to cloud security. And so if we can give you visibility and help you prioritize that risk, we can ultimately allow you to have as much impact as possible to understand your container image risks, how you've configured Kubernetes, but also how you've configured all of your other cloud services.
And the other thing I would add to that, your security team may not be Kubernetes experts now. They may never be Kubernetes experts, but you have teams coming to you saying, hey, it's so easy to spin these up in the cloud rather than dealing with all this access control because we have multiple teams sharing a cluster, networking because multiple teams are sharing a cluster. I want my own cluster and my own cloud account. Now that's another thing the security team has to know about, be aware of, run compliance on, make sure it's patched, all of these other things. Orca makes that really easy. You attach to the cloud account and you can see everything in it, down to the cluster, down to the container, down to the services that are running in those containers. So it makes the security job around Kubernetes, the visibility and this actual understanding the misconfigurations and risks much, much easier for security teams.
That's an extremely good point. I mean, security is already very broad and a complex domain in and of itself, right? So now let's ask security people to be software architects and understand everything about Kubernetes and be SREs and understand, all the operational aspects of running a cloud native stack. It's a lot for people specializing in those areas. So one of the things I really appreciate about the Orca approach is it's a domain that security people understand very well, right? You're examining an environment that you're running and all the elements of it, and that can be done, in a very rapid, dynamic way. You're not looking at just a point in time because this stuff is all changing that we're talking about, right? So security people get it. The information will be super helpful to platform engineering, to security architects, to DevOps engineers, to the software architects. So I think that's that sweet spot in this world we live in of everything has to be secure, but we're living in some pretty complex technology. So appreciate your guys' perspective on that. So, okay, we'll turn off a little bit of the Orca specific view. I know you can't help yourself. You're coming from that view, but appreciate that perspective on it. Let's go ahead and go to our next question. And by the way, folks, if you have people that are joining us, feel free to jump in. If you have a question, it can be about the topics that we have on the screen, questions we've asked. Can be something specific to the Orca folks. This is one I really appreciate because I'm a big believer in security in our software engineering world that we live in. There is no such thing as effective manual security. Things that take someone required to do something every time to make sure it's right. Those are the rare exception today. It has to be integrated into our process and how we work. So this is a great question, talking about, looking at part of your CI/CD process, case and YAML files and lots of different approaches here. So I'm curious what we're going to see from really everyone on this one. So let's go ahead and go, Jared, if you want to share some dynamic results here, real-time results as they're coming in. So clearly the top two are doing well. Folks are agreeing about that. If you don't have your votes in, vote early, vote often. No, you only get to vote once, but you get the idea. We want to see what your perspective on this is. So we've got a good number of responses. So anybody else last minute want to jump in? Going once, going twice. Okay, great. So top of the list. Any surprises to either of you, or any insights you might offer about those things, or maybe we're missing the picture on one of the others? Feel free to jump in, whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, I'm glad to respond. I think one of the very cool things that people have realized is that you have an opportunity using cloud native technologies to address risks before you deploy an application. And I started out in cybersecurity at an application security company, and there were still a lot of organizations that had an approach of, I have a team that builds the application, and it's like we put it in a box, we wheel it down the hall to the next group who's going to deploy it, and then we're going to drop it in front of security later, and they'll take all the time they need to secure it before it gets deployed into a production environment. And I think now that's completely gone out the window. As Jacob described earlier, you could have developers or DevOps teams that quickly provision cloud infrastructure using Kubernetes, build and deploy an application from a source like GitHub or some other public repository. And if you don't have security controls as part of that pipeline, security can't come in later and say, hey guys, we did a 10-day analysis. Here's all the things you need to fix, when they've already missed several important deployments because development and DevOps wants to move fast. So I think this is where a lot of security teams and partnering across the org have started to work with development and DevOps teams to integrate security as part of these workflows. And it's not only looking for vulnerabilities, but it's also looking at how they're provisioning infrastructure as part of Kubernetes YAMLs or infrastructure as code templates, which are really rising in popularity. I think the other dynamic at play that's very cool is there's a lot of development and DevOps teams that understand security as part of the equation for them using some of these technologies, where they actually want to go explore and identify security partners and bring them to the security team because they want to use Kubernetes or they want to use a new build or deployment software. And so they say, hey, security team, we've already done a lot of the legwork for you. Here's how we're integrating as part of our workflows so you can feel better about us using these technologies.
Yep. I'd bring up the results from our Textron group audience here so we can contrast that too. So go ahead, you're going to jump in next, Jacob, even more so on the scanning, right?
Yeah, scanning images is critical. The earlier you can find and address these issues, the cheaper they are to resolve. Because once something hits production, not only did you have risk that has reached production, but now that developer might be working on something else. You're interrupting a sprint down the line. If you can do it right at build time, that is the best time to do it, the cheapest, the most effective, the safest way to do it. Now, you're always going to have things that didn't go through that CI/CD pipeline. Like in theory, and we would love if every single CI/CD pipeline were scanned for vulnerabilities and compliance and misconfigurations and all of these issues. But in practice, you're going to have things that are out in production as well. So you have to have some sort of runtime solution to give you visibility into what is actually deployed. Because I always use the analogy of like rivers and the ocean. Like rivers, if you want to make sure they're clean as they're flowing, that's great. That's CI/CD. But what reaches production, that ocean, even if you have really clean rivers flowing into it, if that ocean's dirty, you're going to be in a bad spot. So you have to make sure you're using something at runtime as well. Looking at what's out there, auditing what's out there, and making sure that you're putting your security controls there as well as in your CI/CD pipeline.
Yeah, it's interesting too, and something you resonate with what you said, Keith. When you bring up those issues at the very end of the process, the security issues, it's like, well, that problem happened way back early. And a matter of fact, I mean, the design, it might have been in some of the early code that we developed, and we would have to go way back to fix that. Now, in a cloud native DevOps world, you have more opportunity to go. It doesn't have to. You don't have to literally step back in time and redesign the whole thing necessarily, but this CI/CD is the point where most organizations start their DevOps process. It's where it all comes together. You're checking in the code, you're doing continuous integration. Some do automated deployment or hand deployment, but that's the point where things show up and you're going to find problems. There are things to do in looking at code as you're writing it and the IDEs and things like that, but it is sort of that nexus point. If there is, a major one, that certainly is, probably the biggest in a DevOps process. And the more dynamic infrastructure we use, now you're talking about infrastructure as code, YAML files, and all kinds of declarative, definitions of our infrastructure. So, the other three, the fact that they were kind of clustered around being about the same, between 12 and 20, not drastically different, I get. But to me, that says, people are focusing on that CI/CD point in time, not at the behest of others, but it's the obvious place to start.
Sorry, go ahead, Keith.
Yeah, no, I'm done.
Oh, I was just going to say it's also the one that's the easiest to automate. If you can build really good scripting and really good processes, you can automate these pieces of security that you're able to look at a lot of code that you couldn't do manually. You couldn't do with the naked eye, but get a lot of results both in native tooling and centralized tooling to understand risk. And so I think the fact that this is an automation point is why a lot of people are very aware that this is something they need to do and also can do.
Yep. And it's also very analogous to things you did on-prem. You need vulnerability scan results. And if you can gateway, that's really fantastic. Scanning IAC templates, that's a little bit more sophisticated. You have to understand, what are we using? Are we even using IAC templates to begin with? Are we using Terraform or CloudFormation? Obviously, we're using some YAMLs if we're in Kubernetes, but there's those other things as well. Now we have to scan them and look at best practices and really some cloud-specific stuff. So that is sort of another layer on top of that. The scanning images, really easy to understand, easy to communicate to your developers, easy to understand why you need to patch vulnerabilities. There's a new critical vulnerability every couple months. We all see them. We all know the importance of it. So it's a really something you can really get buy-in from your teams to do.
Great. Any other points on this before we go to our next question? We're good? Okay. Let's do that. I think this is super interesting. Does your organization have the right tools for securing and processes for securing Kubernetes? We had some really interesting results coming back from our audience from the website polls. So I'm going to be fascinated when this one comes back.
And I hope we hit 100% here, but that's probably not going to happen.
Yeah, I have a suspicion that we won't be at 100%. But we'll see. Hey, I've been wrong many times, so we may be there. So easy question to answer. Yes, no. Jump right in. You feel like you're adequately equipped? You're like, yeah, we got some deficiencies. We got some work to do. Where do we fall out on that? So it's interesting when you ask an audience of varying capabilities. There's also the suppliers of the technology and the people who have to use it. Sometimes you get a variation too in that response, like, oh yeah, we give them everything they need. Well, maybe not, if you're one of those recipients. So let's go ahead and jump to, okay, so we're at 59-41, right on that kind of around 60-40 split, if you will. Let's look at where we came out with our online audience. So pretty close, a lot narrower gap, let's say, but not farther apart, a little bit closer together, 48 and 49, 51%. So almost 50-50. So variance of, 10 points either way, 20 points on roughly in that. So I'm just going to throw in, I'm kind of surprised to see as many people say yes, as said yes. Given we're not 10 years into deploying Kubernetes, we're 2 or 3 or 5, we're not, well, maybe 5. Yeah, it's a relatively new technology. Okay, that's just my perspective. I'm curious what maybe you want to jump in first, Jacob.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. It's really hard to have the right tools to secure Kubernetes, especially if you're an enterprise that's been around a while. You maybe have a legacy security vendor, the same vendors who maybe sold you agents when you were in data centers, and now you're trying to do those same things in a Kubernetes cluster. It's just not going to scale. You have to go to specialized cloud native security companies and see how they are offering their solutions for Kubernetes. It's wildly different than these legacy solutions. And they're more aligned around what you would expect actually running a Kubernetes cluster. Visibility and awareness on all of the different aspects of the cluster, not just saying, hey, we saw a process, but what container is that process associated with? What is the base image, or what is the image that it's built from? What's the base image of that image? Where are the vulnerabilities introduced? These are all really critical things for a modern security solution. And that really is one of the right tools that you need, because you're going to be constantly fighting an uphill battle if you're using a tool that just isn't Kubernetes aware, or just doesn't have the right level of visibility with the right context on those problems in your cluster.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think this speaks to all the complexity that Kubernetes presents and how interconnected the entire attack surface can be. And I think it's great to see that a lot of people feel very confident that they've embedded some really great processes with the right tools. I think that's awesome. And that probably speaks to a lot of the best practices that have developed over the last 5 years, whether it's, NIST guidance, Center for Internet Security benchmarks. We now have a lot of really good resources that people can point to make sure that they're, looking at configuration security and risk prioritization correctly. At the same time, this is a dynamic technology. And so there's always going to be one more piece of the puzzle that you want to solve as you progress in your maturity. So the distribution here makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And remember, this says the right tools and processes. One of the chat messages here says, we're trying to get into the mindset of you build it, you secure it. That's a process thing. But that's also really tough for organizations to actually get to, because sometimes the leader of that security team, if there is an incident, is going to have to go in and say, oh, we just told the developers to do it. That's really tough as well. You have to trust your developers are going to patch and deploy the correct things, but you have to have a solution that's going to let you verify that they actually have done that. And then when you see something that is not the way you would expect, or something that is a risk, being able to track down the owner, being able to set SLAs for patching and redeploying, or whatever it may be in that situation. And sometimes that's really tough when you see a vulnerability in a container that's only been living for 10 minutes. How long has it really been out there? Now you have to use, again, the right tools to see when was that deployment applied, and when was that YAML file created? What pipeline did it go through? There's a lot of different things that you have to be aware of.
Yeah, I wonder too if there may be somewhat of a correlation of, since we had so many people respond to that CI/CD process, and that being that nexus point where we work on a lot of security too, and also as our infrastructure becomes more and more dynamic, right? Infrastructure as code and GitOps, things like that. That to really change, even make, to use your fluid or your water analogy, right? The ocean analogy, and make that even more fluid and constantly changing. That I think we're headed to a more complex world. I think, not less. Maybe of our own making, but yeah, that's sort of I think the trajectory that we're on. Well, let's jump to our next question. And by the way, that's what we have built in here for our polls here. I think I missed one right up front. Let me jump back to that, where we had I just skipped one here. Thanks for indulging me here. This one, so we won't ask our audience on this poll. So how many clusters do you run in Kubernetes across all phases of development? So a quarter, 40% saying 0. We're not there yet, but between 1 and 50, over 51 plus. Not a lot of folks are there. At least they're talking about their development environment. But you have a lot of folks in the kind of 2 to 20 range. Not too surprising. 21 to 50. You think about the number of clusters. That's not a small number either. That can get complex very fast. I'm curious your reaction to this. Maybe you want to jump in, Keith. Your response first.
Yeah, I mean, I'll respond pretty quickly. Jacob's got more frontline experience with customers than I do. But I think this, distribution makes sense to me in that people are, slowly dipping their toes into the water in Kubernetes and others are, using it at greater scale. I think Kubernetes is always this very hot and exciting technology and has been for the last several years. But organizations are still using a lot of traditional virtual machines in how they run their cloud applications. So I expect this distribution to continue to trend higher and higher every time we go back to this poll year over year. But Jacob, I'd be curious, what you would add from your perspective as you work with folks, running Kubernetes all the time.
3 or 4 years ago, I would expect most people would have had the cluster. They deployed the cluster in their environment, and that's where they were running production. It says all phases of development. So maybe they had a non-production as well to test some stuff before it rolled out. That is not the reality today because it is so easy to deploy these clusters. It is so easy to do something in a cloud provider or use a managed Kubernetes solution, an enterprise Kubernetes solution, to get something stood up really rapidly. And now all these teams are wanting some insulation from the other teams. So if you have multiple business units or multiple functions or even just multiple teams, they're likely going to want their own cluster that they can control and get some insulation from those other people and those other teams so they can really focus on theirs. And in a lot of DevSecOps users' minds, that simplifies some things. We know exactly who needs to have access to this cluster, exactly what the networking needs to be. It's all sort of part of the same application. So you're almost seeing applications moving towards a cluster rather than a cluster serving many applications, which is maybe not what we would have expected a couple of years ago. But with, again, cloud service providers making this so easy to spin those up, it actually does make it easy to do that. So I would say the majority of customers that I work with now are probably between 10 and 50. Now, there's some kind of on the far end, but that's probably a good range of what I see.
Great. Well, I know we've tried to incorporate some of the audience questions here. We're doing okay on time. I think we've got a good opportunity if there's any, before we wrap things up, if there's a kind of a takeaway message, either from what we might have learned from these polls from the audience and from our online audiences, or maybe something we haven't gotten to. I just think, well, I've been doing this for a little while. I carry it forward from my other jobs into this one. Be worth sharing. If I had to share one thing with somebody, what might it be? Either one of you, go first. Anything else you'd like to highlight?
One thing that I thought was interesting in the data was 39% of respondents still weren't using any sort of Kubernetes at all. But if they're looking at this sort of stuff, especially on this webinar today, you're looking at maybe deploying your first cluster and trying to understand what are those risks, what do I need to look out for? And in my opinion, a little bit biased, but I still think it's critical. Get a good security vendor up front who can give you that visibility and help you go on the right path, because it's much easier to do these things right early than to have the wild, wild west and come in and try to tame it. That's very, very hard and something we deal with a lot. And we have good tooling and good ways to address all of that as well, but it's always better if you start early. If you start early and start building things the right way, if you're following CIS benchmarks and doing that from day one, it's going to be easier over time. And it gives you a blueprint and a repeatable blueprint as you go in from that one cluster, the cluster, into those 5, 10, 20 clusters that you're going to end up deploying in your environment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my takeaway building on what we've talked about today is just to tell anyone listening, there are more resources than ever for you to not only explore how Kubernetes works, but also security themes where you can have an interactive online terminal at no cost to really get interactive with a Kubernetes cluster and how you would secure it. And I would really encourage people to, get involved with the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, log on to tools like Katacoda, check out Kubernetes Goat, which is an insecure Kubernetes application that you can learn about. And I think it really is a very cool thing to know that you can chisel out some time during your workday, even if it's only a couple of hours, even if it's 90 minutes, or some time on a weekend, to come up to speed pretty quickly, which again, I think speaks to the community and how they want to maintain Kubernetes and deliver security for a lot of people. And so I would just encourage anyone, if you have a lot of questions or ideas, check out a lot of those resources and potentially explore a learning path that works for you.
I think those are both great sentiments. The one thing I also want to give folks an opportunity, if anybody would like to learn more about Orca security, maybe I get a chance to work with some of your technology, whether you're a platform engineer, security engineer, software engineer, software architect, I think any of those folks are viable candidates to get their perspective on, is Orca security aligning with sort of our view on how we do things and how you can fit into our process and our environment, or somebody that we can learn from as they're working with other companies. Maybe Keith, what are people? How do people work with you if they're just finding out Orca security? Do you have some online resources? Do you have accounts they can check out? Things like that.
Yeah. So I'll give you 3 opportunities if you're interested in learning more about Orca. Number 1, you can visit our website at orca.security, check out our product pages, use case pages, and learn on your own. Number 2 is we have a hosted recorded demo that you can access on our website. So in 10 minutes, you can understand a little bit about our UI and some of the most common use cases that our customers experience. And then number 3, if you are interested in getting hands-on with the product and understanding your current cloud security posture, you can sign up for a free risk assessment. And so at no charge, our team will work with you to get Orca up and running. It can happen as little as under a day. And you'll start to get telemetry back about the security of your cloud environment. And all of this information is, available on the website. You fill out a form and our team will work with you. But ultimately, there's lots of different ways that all, flow through our website to learn about the Orca platform.
Or you can visit our booth next week at AWS Reinforce as well. We'll be in Boston, and if you're there, if you're looking at cloud and Kubernetes and security, you might already be going to Reinforce. You can find us there as well.
And Sarah just posted a link to the cloud security risk assessment, so check that out. Easy, kind of free thing to grab and kind of get started, get a perspective on it. So, well, this has been great. And as I mentioned earlier, it's been fantastic working with the entire Orca security team. Well, not everyone that we work with, but the people we worked with at Orca have been fantastic. And helping put together some of the research and the questions we want to learn from our audiences. We do want to share a couple things with you. One is, now I got to go back to the end of my slides here, so if you'll pardon me. The stats that we talked about with some analyst analysis is in a document called this Pulse Meter document, and we will provide that to everyone who is in attendance today, who's registered. Maybe you came, maybe you didn't show up, but if you signed up, you can get that document. Actually, we will send it to you in an email with a recording to the webinar, so you'll be able to get that, and that'll be available to you in short order next day or so. We'll send that to everybody. It also will be available, I think, on the Orca site, but you'll have that at some point here soon. You can get it from orca.security as well. So download that. It's free. It's got some kind of additional thinking, some of the things we said here, but other things we didn't discuss. And also looking at kind of from a cross-vendor industry perspective, giving you some different viewpoints on that too. So that's free and coming to an inbox near you soon. Also, there's a lot of resources, as you mentioned, Keith, many great ones. Here's where my bias comes through with TechStrong. We have a lot of great sites with great content. Cloud native is a huge part of the topics that we talk about in security across all of it. We have an event coming up on API security. We have another one coming up on Cloud Days. cloud native days. So there's a number of things happening, resources to get access to that way too. So go to any of our websites, devops.com. You can find out about that, Security Boulevard, Container Journal, etc. And also the security research, our research site is techstrongresearch.com. We've got other great reports there, other reports on Kubernetes security too. So, gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. You're fantastic, and I've had a chance to work with you in the past on other online activities. It's great to be able to do that again. Again, thanks to Jared, and he's going to close things out, and Sarah and team. So we'll turn it back to you.
All right, that was outstanding. Thank you, Mitch, Jacob, and Keith for taking the time to discuss and share all your expertise with us today. I just want to give you all a quick reminder that today's session was recorded. Following the panel, you'll receive an email, the link to access the recording on demand. You can also find the recording on devops.com/webinars. It'll be waiting for you there here shortly. I do want to mention again that we have 4 gift card winners to Amazon. Our winners today were Carlos M, Sylvian L, Alicia C, and Heather H. Congratulations to the 4 of you. Please keep an eye out on your inbox to claim your gift card. If you don't receive it in your inbox, be sure to check out your spam folder. They have been known to show up there from time to time. Thank you again for our speakers, and also I want to thank each of you for taking the time and taking the time out of your day and listening to us for the entirety of the program. At this time, I will be signing off. Thank you again, and have a great day.